Welcome to the Sheff United Way. I am delighted to, just in a second, welcome a man who I believe shares the way many of us are feeling, have been feeling, and will continue to feel about the beautiful game in its existing form. Far from what many of us fell in love with, this could be the most important discussion we ever have on this channel and the most important idea, dare I say it, that we ever share. 𝗞𝗶𝗴 Kerr is joining me, and I am so pleased that he is. How are you today?
I'm very well, Hal, and thanks so much for having me on.
It's an absolute pleasure. We've got a lot to discuss, so we're not going to take too much time with the small talk. Instead, we're going to say that, Micky, you're the author of Football, the People's Shame, out at the start of December 2024. This book is in 3 parts. The history of English football, naturally, is where you begin. I'm sure, like many of us, you have fond memories of your first forays into watching professional football, but some may feel, and I've already alluded to it, that the game we know, that we love, has changed. And I want to kind of get straight into this. You have a plan to save football. I know that you'll outline it, but can you give us an overview of the book before we get into the finer detail?
Yeah, sure. It's basically, like you said, split into 3 parts. The first part explains what's happened to English football. The second part explains what we can do to change it. And the third part, it's more of like a look at who English football supporters are, English fandom as a whole. What do we stand for? And how we've been changed, I think, as well, by a monopolization process, a commercialization process. This is a pretty radical idea, and there's a lot to get through. So I'm wary of cognitive overload, which is trying to say too much.
There might be people watching and thinking, well, I love football. What's wrong? What do you think is wrong with modern football?
It's changed from the people's game into the people's shame, basically. It used to be a very community-based thing, a very fair, like sporting integrity meant quite a lot. We'll go into the Victorian Regulation and the Victorian principles of sport, and that's a key word, sport. The Victorians saw football as a sport first and a business second, and that's been reversed. And I think that's the problem. Football is more of a business than a sport now. And with that come grave repercussions for fans and for people with a meaningful connection to their club, because we're the ones that are losing out here. And it's not just about being regressive in the sense of looking back to the past with misty-eyed nostalgia and thinking, oh, football should be a community sport again. This is a way of looking back into the past and taking the best elements, but moving forward into the 21st century and keeping that global brand. Because you're right, English football is still brilliant in so many ways. And it is a leading brand, a leading global brand. And we've got to maintain that. And there are actually loads of economic kind of advantages to loads of facets of globalization that we want to keep, but we also want to make it a community sport again. So the ideas I've got are basically bringing the best elements of the old world into the new world, if you want. But I'd like to start, if that's okay, with the Victorian
go for it.
Kind of regulation, the Victorian way of thinking about sport. We'll go deep back. When football was first professionalised, it was 1885, and it was a very popular sport. You know, people wanted to be involved with football, and you had big gate receipts. People were going to matches, and you got the start of a business model. So they turned football clubs into public limited companies, because then you can de-risk it. So basically, if it all goes wrong, you're not liable, the company is. But the FA said, okay, you can do that. You want to build stadiums. But they created a really important piece of regulation called Rule 34. So Rule 34 meant that stakeholders in football clubs, shareholders, couldn't take out shares. You weren't allowed to take funds out of a football club. And if a football club was ever liquidated, all the money went to charity. Basically, it meant that football clubs were community assets. Yeah, they could operate like businesses, but they weren't standard businesses. They were clubs in their mentality. You know, that kind of gut feeling that a support has that this is a club. That was in the regulation. So Rule 34 is really important, and the Victorians established that, first of all. Now, you won't be surprised to learn that Rule 34 isn't being adhered to anymore. The Victorians also had some interesting regulation. They allowed free markets to reign till 1901, and then they put a wage cap on because they could see the monopolization. They also had the sharing of gate receipts. So if you went to a bigger club, you actually shared the money. So it's very egalitarian, very fair, because like I said, the Victorians had this ideology that football's a sport. It's about fair competition. Anyone in the country could win. You had, Burnley were a great team in the 20s, won it 3. The Wolves teams as well, Wolverhampton Wanderers. Anyone could win it. Newcastle in the 50s, Arsenal in the 30s. You didn't have it was shared around. You didn't have this monopolization at all because it was written into the regulation. Wage cap, the sharing of gate receipts. So it was very, very fair. And football clubs are tightly controlled. Yes, there's a business element to football. Of course there is. But it's strictly regulated and controlled. Interestingly, it's the same ideology the Americans have. So the Americans are basically the same. They see sport as a sport first and a business second. You look at the MLS, a lot of the regulation that I've imported it from the Americans. The MLS is the same, wage cap. You look at the NFL, the weakest teams in the NFL get the first pick of the draft. And it's designed to make sure that you've got sporting integrity. You've got fair competition. So that's the ideology that the Victorians had. And I don't think it should be dismissed as naive or not fitting for the modern age, because it totally is. So how did football change from this Victorian kind of fair competition? Football used to be known as the people's game. That's what it was called. And you just don't hear that anymore because I think psychologically, subconsciously, we all know it isn't. So I've just got some notes here. They're not very good, but it'll help keep us on track. But how did football change from the people's game and into the people's shame? The key decade is the 1970s. You've got a few things happening in the 1960s, like the wage cap was lifted in 61. And you've got this idea of, players are getting paid more because the wage cap was ridiculously low. It lasted 60 years. But in the 70s, you've got a huge change in ideology, in economic ideology. And I'm talking about the wider political landscape. I'm talking about Britain here. In 1970, oil was cheap. Unemployment was low. But by 1980, that's reversed. Oil is very expensive. Unemployment's very high. There's a Middle Eastern oil crisis in the mid-70s. It impacted this country massively. We didn't have enough money. We didn't have enough oil to run the economy. We had to go down to a 3-day week. We had to apply to the IMF as well, the International Monetary Fund, for help. In the end, we didn't get it. We didn't need it. It was a real national humiliation. Basically, nothing was working. We've had the winter of discontent, which was 1978. And what's happened is that post-war kind of consensus has fallen apart. Keynesianism, basically, is this economic ideology, John Maynard Keynes. In the post-war era, after World War II, the country's bankrupt, but there's a big emphasis on state control. They created the NHS. You've got this collectivism is in. And by the 1970s, that's fallen apart now, and people want to change. And in its place comes neoliberalism, which is the idea, it's the opposite of state control and collectivism. It's about individualism, it's about big business, and it's about deregulation, which is important in football in terms. And it's about privatization, again, really important in football in terms, because this wider economic landscape affects football. People often say, keep politics out of football. And you know what they mean, want to watch football to escape. We don't want all the hassles of the wider world. And you understand that thinking. But it's also, in this context, really naive because football's very political. The governance of football is affected massively by politics. And what we see is this switch from collectivism to individualism. And like I said, it massively impacts football. In the late 70s, you have Thatcher in 1979, she comes in. And just before that, actually, you have advertising coming into football. So the idea of business and commercialisation is starting to seep into the game. In 1972, there was an advertising ban. They upheld it. But by 1977, I think it is, sponsorship comes in. So you've just got this seeping through of individualism, commercialisation. The key year in football is 1983. Most people will go to 1992, 1993, the start of the Premier League era for the hinge point. but it's not. You don't just start a revolution, as I'm finding out. You've got to lay the political foundations. And that took about 10, 15 years. Why is 1983 so significant? Firstly, you've got an advancement in technology, which massively impacts football and still does now. It changes football. You've got broadcasting coming in for the first time. So a duopoly between the BBC and ITV. 1983 is the first season you've got regular live football. It's been aired weekly. So there's money coming into the industry. And you think about that switch, that ideology from collectivism to individualism. The club owners are thinking, we could do some of this. There's rich people involved with football. They want that money. You've also got, that's the first year they stopped sharing gate receipts. Remember, we mentioned that earlier. That was all scrapped in 1983. But 1983 is probably more significant because of this. It's the first time that Rule 34 was abandoned. It wasn't abandoned, it was just bypassed. Rule 34 has never been receded. It was still in the FA handbook up until I think it's the late 1990s. David Conn is your source on this, great football journalist, 𝗍𝗫𝗵𝗶, David Conn. He's done a lot of great work on Rule 34. But 1983 is when it first happens. It's 𝗚𝗿𝗲𝗲𝗕. He's the chairman of Spurs. He handed it over to Sugar in 85. He's the first person that does it. He writes to the FA and he says, I want to abandon Rule 34. I want to take money out of Spurs. They didn't bother to reply. So he went about his commercialisation plan. How he did it was this. It's a holding company model. Spurs are the parent company. He set up a holding company tethered to Spurs. So the money went from the parent company into the holding company. And guess who owns the holding company? So that's how they did it. That's how they bypassed this regulation. And 𝗚𝗏𝗏𝗏's holding company model becomes the norm then. This is all happening behind the scenes. No one knows about this. But that's how they got round Rule 34. And that's how you get, for example, football clubs started to become floated on the stock exchange. I think Spurs were the first to do it in 85. I think it was Sugar who did that. But now because you can take money out of football clubs, now you've got a standard business. Football clubs used to be tethered to communities through Rule 34 and various other regulations. Now they're not. Now you've got this deregulation, this privatization, this what we talked about earlier, this economic switch. So that's how it came about in terms of the commercialization agenda. You've got the advertising coming in. You've got the sponsorship. At first, it was kept quite small because the BBC had regulation about you weren't allowed to advertise. But then that was gradually ignored as well as this neoliberal kind of consensus began to take a foothold elsewhere in the economy and throughout our entire institutions, actually. By 1987, every single football club has got, in the top tier, has got a sponsor emblazoned across the top. So it took 10 years to normalise. And that is quite interesting, in the mid 70s, it was alien concept to have advertising. Why would you have a random business across a football top? But it took 10 years. And that's an interesting concept for the ESL, I think, to normalise something, to get it into the psyche. 10 years feels like a long time, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not really. You've also got as well, what's happening in the 1980s is capitalism's kind of defeat over communism and the fall of the Berlin Wall. There's only one game in town now. And there's regulations by the wayside. It's time to make some money. It's big business. Hillsborough is huge in English football. I think it's 1989, Hillsborough. And, English football is struggling. People are leaving English football. Not as many people are going. You've got fandom and hooliganism and stuff like that. And this, Hillsborough's a stopping point. They turned around and said, we've got all these all-seater stadiums. Something's got to be done. The Labour opposition, actually, it was the Tories in charge. The Labour said, we should use the football pools to do this. The pools was an old form of gambling. About 250 million a year was coming in through the pools. But the Tories said, no. Let clubs fund it themselves by negotiating better broadcasting deals. We talked about 1983, 1984 being the first time broadcasting's coming in. The technology is getting better. The pitches are getting better as well. It comes from American US golf, this drainage system. So that you can see that the technology is impacting football. The pitches are getting better. The football's improving as well. But a lot from America, actually, the idea of professionalism and diets and stuff like that. So that all this is coming in. Football's becoming more and more commercial. And then 1992 hits, well, I've probably jumped a gun here if we're doing it properly. I'm just going to, the sunshine is really, is that better in terms of, I'm just wary of the sun coming in. I mean, I'm in England.
We want as much of your face as humanly possible, Micky.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'll tell you what else is big, for those who remember it. It's the 1990 World Cup was massive. It's the first time that Murdoch sees that English football is actually not this backward thing that people don't want to be engaged with. 25 million people tuned in to watch that semi-final defeat against Germany in 1990, and Murdoch's losing billions with his Sky TV. They've got this, basically just cinema. He was doing films. No one's buying it, and he's in billions of debt. He sees that, and he goes, right. So he takes a punt on English football. 𝗤𝗿𝗄𝐻𝗫's been doing this in the 80s in Serie A. He's been doing it since 1980. So the idea that you can broadcast football is probably 𝗤𝗿𝗄𝐻𝗫's the pioneer. Murdoch sees what he's doing, and you've got this satellite communications technologies now coming as well. So 𝗕𝗍𝗃 was going to take him to the broadcasting monopoly as well. You can't get a monopoly like that. The Monopoly Act of 1965 says you can't. So 𝗕𝗍𝗃, again, Labour in opposition, is saying, I'm going to take Murdoch to the cleaners here. He's not getting English football. But there's a surprise election victory by the Tories weren't supposed to win that election. John Major was successful. They dumped Thatcher. She was out. Major comes in, and the person who secured that in large part was Murdoch. His papers just went for the opposition, and he's got a big influence on the psyche of the British people as Rupert Murdoch, and he won the Tories the election in 1992, and with that he was granted all these political favours. Sky didn't have the regulatory constraints of the BBC and the ITV. The monopoly thing was ignored, so he's given rite of passage. You've got this increasing technology, a better technology. You've got broadcasting technologies coming in. You've got the political favours. You've got the wider economic landscape. You've got Hillsborough. It's all a perfect storm for Murdoch, and the Premier League is forged from there. So that's the basic kind of concepts of how English football changed from being this community thing into this. Well, it's a commercial juggernaut, really, isn't it? The Premier League, and it's not to say it's been a bad thing. It has, but it's also been a really good thing. That global kind of reach it's got. I'm jumping ahead of myself a bit here, but that's a fantastic opportunity for us as well, if we think about broadcasting ownership in a different way. But if it's okay with you, I'd like to talk about monopolization now, because this is the start of it. It wasn't the big six back then; it was the big five. And that's who helped Murdoch get in. It's Everton, Liverpool, Man United, Spurs, and Arsenal. They're the five clubs, and all the money it's not shared between the top 20. I think it's top 24 clubs. Then it's not shared evenly. It just goes up to the biggest teams. The amount of money that went to the Premier League teams in 92-93 was just over 60 million. Fast forward 30 years and it's just over 3 billion. So that's a 5,000% increase in 30 years. So what you've got is this huge expansion in terms of the gap between the best and the rest. And this is a process. It's not finished. It's actually accelerating more than ever, this monopolization process. I'm going to use that phrase, the gap between the best and the rest, a couple more times, because that's exactly what's happening. And like I said, it's not finished. It's happening still. It will end up becoming a European Super League, and that's already happening in our minds already. And it's already been thrust into the legal realm of possibility in December last year. It was ruled by the courts that UEFA and FIFA tried to block it, and that was illegal. So you can already see the European Super League happening. The economics are really telling when you look at it. It will happen. But I'd like to go back to 93 and 1994, just to show basically how different the Premier League is now from then. You had newly promoted teams in 93 and 94 finishing in third place. It was Newcastle and Forest, I think. The last time a newly promoted team even finished inside the top five was Ipswich Town, believe it or not, in 2001. Now, you look at Ipswich Town going up, it's not fun, is it? I know Sheffield United's season last year it's not fun. I'm a Leeds fan, it's not fun. I was quite glad when we stayed down, actually. You have got no chance anymore in the Premier League as a newly promoted side. I mean, finishing inside the top 5, it's just not going to happen. It's just a dogfight for survival because the gap between the best and the rest is so wide now. The rest of the pyramid is ignored in the early stages of Murdoch's plan. Division 2 as it was then and below received nothing. And it's still pretty much the case now. You do get parachute payments, of course, but that just means you've got kind of like 23 clubs now just going up and down. It's tough on the championship teams. Sheffield United, I don't know what your wage bill's like. Got a couple of mates, Sheffield United fans, and they're not too confident really about this season. I'm not sure how big your wage bill is, but the idea is that Leicester last season was 60-odd million, which was, I think the nearest to them was us, and we were just over 40 million. So you can see Ipswich Town have upset the apple cart there and actually had an incredible season on a really modest wage bill. That is not supposed to happen, but it has. And Leicester is the other anomaly. So the monopolisation process isn't immune to glitches, but they don't happen very often and they're happening less than less. I think that the monopolisation process is best revealed by Premier League points tallies for winners. So I divided the Premier League up into decades. We're in the 4th decade now, of course. No one's ever done this research before, and I think as fans, no one's looking at the bigger picture. I think this is a failure of journalism as well, because we all think small in our own club's bubble, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's what we use football for. But as a result of that, no one's thinking big and no one's thinking long term. This is what the book is trying to do. That's what we need to address. Yeah, we can all be in our club's bubble, and football's very tribal, and that's great. But at the same time, I think we need to have an eye on the bigger picture. What's happening to the game and what's happening to us as football supporters as well, and how this commercialisation and the monopolisation agenda has affected our psyche, because I think it massively has. But like I said, I think we should park that just for the time being, because this book is a platform for a debate that doesn't exist yet. So, but let's just talk about a little bit more about the monopolisation process before we try and figure out how we can fix football. When you look back at the Premier League era, the first 10 years, the average points tally to win it was 81. Second 10 years, it goes up to 87. And the third 10 years, it goes to 91. So you can see it's got up 10 points. Leicester, that glitch, that happened in 2015-16, I think. They won it on 81 points, and I think they won it by 10 points. So for whatever reason, that monopolisation process, it just faltered. It didn't work in that season. But in the 7 seasons after that, the average points tally goes up to 94. So you can see it's gone from 91 to 94. It should be 95, but City dropped 5 points in the last 2 games of the season because they'd already won the league and they had a Champions League on the final on the horizon. They played weakened teams. So you can see that, basically now what you've got is 114 points in the Premier League is the maximum. City have already made 100. You've got to basically get about 95 points if you want to win it. That's the way to look at it now. So you can only really drop around 20 points, which is just ridiculous. You can have a 5-game patch where you win 1, lose 1, draw 3, and you've just dropped 9 points. It's not even that bad a run. You can't really afford to do that again. It's just unbelievable how many points these the Premier League sides are winning. I think Liverpool finished second on 97. You go back to 1996, 97. You've got that Kevin Keegan rant. I'd love it if we beat them. Man United won it on 75 points. It's just widening significantly. You can see this in the FA Cup as well. My first footballing memory is 1988. It's when the Crazy Gang beat Liverpool 1-0 in the final. In the 36 seasons after that, the big 6, we know they are, they've won it on 32 occasions, which is 90%. In the EFL Cup, it's a similar pattern. Since 2004, Borough's victory, Middlesbrough's win. The big 6 have won it on 18 out of 20 against the same figure, 90% of the time. In the European Champions League, we've mentioned the ESL's happening. It's hearing everything but name. 75% of European Champions League trophies, have been won by just 7 teams. And they're the teams competing in the top 4 leagues: Italy, Spain, England, and Germany. You know, you look back to the 1980s, before the rebranding of the European Cup, you had teams, 𝗬𝗏 𝗵𝗶𝗴 won it, a Romanian team. It's just unthinkable now. You had Hamburg SV, not obscure team in Germany, but, you know, not one of the European giants. You had Nottingham Forest. In 1990, you had Red Star Belgrade won it. So the victories like this from underdogs are wiped from the map completely. They just don't happen anymore.
And that's
so
a shame.
This is where it is a shame. And I think the romance of football is dead. And the clubs as we used to know them are dead. And English football, as it used to be, is dead. It's something completely different now. It's a commercialized agenda. Where, you know, it's also a geopolitical playground, interestingly enough. And the goalposts have shifted gradually. But because we've not been looking at the bigger picture, the goalposts have shifted to somewhere completely different now, you know, and we've taken our eye off the ball. And we've got to stop thinking that the governing authorities or anybody's going to come and save us, because they're not. We have to stand up and we have to change football ourselves.
What are your thoughts on how we can change things? Something you focus on part 2 in the book.
Okay, yeah. Well, first of all, let's talk about the fact that something really basic, but football needs new intellectual foundations. We're going to go back to what the Victorians did and actually what the Americans do now. So basically, instead of like authoritarianism, which sounds like a big word, but that's how clubs are run. The Premier League tell us how it is. There's no democracy in English football at all. Something important to remember. No one's ever asked us what we want. You've never been asked as a fan, what do you want? It's not a conversation we have. So instead of like authoritarianism, over commercialization, individualism, and monopolization, we're going to switch the intellectual foundations to democracy, community support, sporting integrity, and collectivism. And as soon as you say collectivism, you think, that's communism. But this is the sporting realm. It's not the wider economy. We're not talking about the wider economy. We're just ring fencing the football sector. It's a sporting realm. And this is what, like I said, a lot of the regulations I'm going to suggest are what the Americans do. And you cannot call the Americans communist because it's just a non-starter. It's nonsensical. So it's important to remember that we've got to change the intellectual foundations. That's the first thing to think about. So how are we going to do it, though? You know, it feels impossible. It's not. I want to mention Brexit now, and I'm not going to say whether Brexit's been a good or a bad thing, but in terms of the nationalisation of English football, which is what I'm going to propose, it's a really good thing. The reason is you can't nationalise football from inside the EU because we're going to dispossess owners of their property and they will be able to appeal to the European courts. It will be a really, really messy and really drawn out affair. And they do have legislation which stops state monopolies. It's quite a neoliberal economic structure, the EU. They like free markets. So that's what it's all about. You've got to have competition. So I'm suggesting, no, there should be no competition. We should just own the monopoly, which is what we're going to do. So outside the EU, all that regulation's gone. All that red tape has gone. This is what Brexit was actually about. If you voted for Brexit because you wanted to kick out the unelected foreigners, which was a phrase, you know, this will do that. If you voted for British sovereignty, this is exactly what it's about. It's about Britain owning a British cultural institution, which is what football is. So, you can't just take someone's property, but you can. Now, we might be outside the EU, but we're still bound by the European Court of Human Rights, which has been part of UK law since 1998. A lot of people want to get out of it. So for migrants, you know, to send them back and stuff, because it gives migrants human rights. It protects the poor, but it also protects the rich. And people often forget that. But the European Court of Human Rights does have a way of nationalising things, because this does happen. You can nationalise. You can take someone's property. It's got to be done in accordance with the law, and it's got to be done in the public interest. And when it is done, you've got to give them a market valuation for their property. So those three things, really, those three things you've got to adhere to. One, you've got to do it legally. Two, you've got to do it in the public interest. And three, you've got to pay them for it. So this is how we're going to do it. States intervention, acts of parliament. And it's just a small sector of the economy. It's not a big deal. It's a tiny sector, is football. We'll go into that in a minute. You do it through acts of parliament. You dispossess them of their property. You pay them market value. And because it's in the public interest, it's all perfectly legal. They have absolutely no say in this whatsoever. You've got to organise politically. You've got to think big. You've got to think long term. That's how you get rid of the club owners, through state intervention and through acts of parliament. It's the only way to do it. And with this as well, the EFL are going, the PL are going, the FA are going, all the governing bodies, they're all getting replaced. There's no point in dealing with neoliberals or neoliberal sympathisers, because they've totally failed English football. So they're all going. It's a clean sweep. It's a revolution. Acts of parliament, they're all going. How are we going to pay for it? Well, I'll come to that in a second, because we can pay for it. But I want to mention HS2 now. And that's an example of someone having their property taken off them. HS2 is a railway line from London to Birmingham. It was supposed to go to Sheffield and Leeds and Newcastle and Manchester, but they've totally messed it up. The contracting has been terrible. It stops at Birmingham. If you're in the way of that, you've had your property taken off you, because it's in the public interest. You get market value for your house. You usually get a bit more, as a sweetener. And you've got to go and live somewhere else. There's nothing you can do. And it's the same concept as it will be for the football club owners. HS2 has cost £70 billion. I'm going to mention as well, it might feel like a tangent, but it's important for context, is the Elizabeth line. That's another bit of railway that's part of London's kind of sprawling metropolis. The Elizabeth line has cost £22 billion. You can buy every single football club, every single one in England, for somewhere between 25 and 30 billion. So football is very, very, very cheap. Less than half the price of HS2. And around a similar price for just one segment of London's sprawling underground network. For context, if we do manage to get them, because market valuations of football clubs, it's not an exact science. It's up for political debate, actually, how much our clubs cost. But it's in the region of 25 to 30 billion. That's been verified by Kerr, who's arguably like the leading financial expert in English football. Kieran's worked with me on the book for like 2 years, helping out and doing what he can, which has been amazing. So when you look at it at 25 billion, by the way, it's 2/3 the price of Track and Trace. Track and Trace is a spreadsheet that costs 37 billion. So that's the first thing we're going to think about. The fact that football is culturally really significant and plays a big role in our lives, spiritually, emotionally, like I say, culturally, but economically, it's tiny. Now, if we did, let's say, secure them for 30 billion, which isn't a massive amount, like Liz Truss gave the energy companies 130 billion for continuing to rip us off. If you want to nationalise water and energy, it's going to cost hundreds of billions. Nationalising football, it's a fraction. You look at 10% of that cost. So financially speaking, this is quite, it's a financial, it's a really good endeavour. It's believable. It's not a massive amount of money. How are we going to pay for it? First of all, English football makes a lot of money. Really, it's the broadcasting. That's what we're going to own as well. We're going to collectively own broadcasting, as well as football clubs. The technology exists and the customer base exists to get £24 billion a year into our economy that we will own. How's that going to happen? First of all, you've got to have a single digital platform. The way that broadcasting is done now, the Premier League sell the rights off to various companies around the world. They buy it up for their region, market it, and deliver it to their customer base. If you do it from a single source where you stream it, all that fragmentation is gone. It becomes a lot more efficient. Apple are already doing this in the MLS. This model already exists. The MLS, like I say, are in bed with Apple, and they're streaming live MLS to the rest of the world. Obviously, their fan base is far smaller. Streaming of English football has already happened. Amazon were the first to do it in 2019. The technology was really good. It passed the test. The technology is only improving. Again, we're going back to technological advancements impacting the game. And really, the Premier League being behind. They should have done. This is the 21st century. We should be streaming it digitally. Also, as well, what a fantastic opportunity, because Britain has no digital tech infrastructure at all. We're completely reliant on American firms, Apple, Microsoft, Meta, Google, all those, whatever. We don't have any of our own web servers. So this is a great opportunity. We create a digital tech platform. It won't cost a massive amount to do. You can run it for about 500 million a year. Premier League wages are about 3.5 billion. So, you're looking at costs of around 4 billion. 200 million people around the world already pay to watch Premier League football, upwards of £30 a month. If you charge them just £10 a month, that's £24 billion a year. Take away the 4 billion, that's 20 billion profit. And in the big games, you're looking at 500, 600 million people that are tuning in to watch Premier League football. So that's our customer base. If you could get them to part with £10 a month, really, really cheap, that you're looking at £60 billion a year. So this is how you run football as a collectively owned public service. I'll go into the ownership model in a minute, because this is not nationalisation in terms of Clement Attlee, where the state owns everything. It's a different type of nationalisation. There's a new form called a public commons partnership. But before I go into that, I want to talk about more funding streams of revenue, because yes, broadcasting to an international subscriber base is a no-brainer from a single source. Amazing. But what about gambling? It's such an easy thing to think about, and such an obvious thing to think about. Just set up a public gambling company, embed it in the private sector, and let it grow. We own that company. When the house wins, we win. When you win, you win. It's a win-win situation. It's the epitome of a self-sustaining economic model, where the wages that were, the players that were betted on, so that money's paying their wages. I think it's worth about 16 billion a year, gambling in the UK. Denise Coates is the owner of 𝗣𝗿𝗲𝗄. She owns it with a family, so they've all got equal shares. She's worth 8 billion. That's how much money is involved in gambling in the UK. A lot of it just goes offshore. To be fair to Denise Coates, she paid herself 400 million. It's the highest ever wage in England, with 48 million dividends. I think it was around 2020. And to be fair to her, she taxed that. She could have gone offshore like they do. But let's just get a bit of the gambling money into the communities that we, and there's wider debates about regulation and gambling and the dark side of it, but the book just touches on it. But I'm just talking about how we can fund the game here. Gambling's a no-brainer. What else do you do at football? You drink. What about setting up a public brewery as well? A collectively owned brewery. It could be one massive brewery that supplies the entire country, or it could be microbreweries attached to clubs. Each club develops its own beer, or clusters of clubs come together. You get the idea. It's a fluid concept, but the idea is that when you scan the taps on match day, that drink or those drinks pay back into football. It's just a way of recycling our own consumerism back towards ourselves. We've got the international subscribers, but we've also got our own pastimes as well. And the final thing that I'd like to bring into this huge manufacturing sector that we're going to create through football is shirt manufacturing. Replica shirts get made by Adidas, Nike. They pay ridiculous wages. I think he's looking at pence, less than £1 an hour. Over in Asia, we could talk about the moral landscape of that, but most of the top 10 of English clubs selling all around the world. They're not buying these tops because they support Nike or Adidas. They're buying them because they support Liverpool and Man United and Arsenal and so on. So we could take shirt manufacturing onto these shores. And the great thing about that is helps with the trade balance. We've got a huge trade deficit. We don't have any manufacturing, and it's really harmful for the economy because services and consumerism don't produce great productivity growth, but manufacturing does. So this is a way of exporting products. We would have to do it as non-profit, I think, to balance the books a little bit, and I think we'd have to have some manufacturing offshore, probably in Asia. But it gives us, geopolitical leverage over other countries. We turn around and say, do you want some factories? It's 5,000 jobs. China are desperate for jobs at the minute. So we own the rights to all this shirt manufacturing. It gives us geopolitical leverage. It gives us hard economic power. So what we've created here is a huge manufacturing sector through football that goes across various sectors. It's actually a huge multinational corporation, because if you own the broadcasting rights, you own the advertising. We can advertise our products, our breweries, our shirts, obviously, our gambling companies or company, to the rest of the world as well. So this is about going on the front foot, and you want to commercialise English football, let's go. But we own all the rights, and we're going to own it through something called a public commons partnership. I mentioned earlier about this is not a standard form of nationalisation. A public commons partnership is partially owned by the state, but mainly owned by the collective. It's called the Common Association. So you'll be a paying member, a common association, and the state own it. But the state could own maybe say 20% of it. We own 80%. We own them, not like the 49-51 thing you see in Germany, far more weighted in our favour. How public commons partnerships are actually governed is really interesting. It's not just two things, it's three separate entities. You've got the state, the local authority, because public commons partnerships are merged with local councils. So we will actually influence the council for things like land purchases, things need to get done. It's not a case of the council telling us what to do, as they so often do, or spend our money terribly. We will influence them. You have the Common Association as well, which is paid members, and you've got the joint enterprise, and that's basically a body of specialists in a particular field. So for a football club, our football clubs will be run by specialists, like they should be. But it's all democratically done, and the Common Association will have members on the local council and on the body of experts, just to make sure it's what we want, whatever we want to do. That's how it works. But we've got the government on side, the local council on side, and we're guided by experts. So a public commons partnership is how football clubs will operate. But this whole wider manufacturing thing I've talked about will also be in itself a colossal public commons partnership. You'll pay £10 a month to join your football club, and you'll pay an extra £1 a month to also be a member of this wider public commons partnership, the manufacturing sector, which is one of the biggest multinational companies in the UK, a huge corporation, and that gives us lobbying power over central government. It's a way of democratising our national economy and devolving economic power towards ourselves. It will give us a lot of political clout. And this is not a utopian vision, because it's democracy, which causes a lot of problems and a lot of logistical issues. They're just better issues, better problems to have. Because at the minute, there's no democracy. We're just powerless serfs. So this is a way of actually devolving, like I say, political and economic clout towards ourselves. So that's the model, public commons partnerships, and we own everything. This is a complete revolution.
Taking back control. Yeah. Actually, you just mentioned there, I just want to touch on something. So you say we would pay, what is it, £11 a month in total?
Yeah.
And that's if you're in Britain. What if you're overseas and you want to sort of support Manchester United or Liverpool?
Well, Hal, you've touched upon the next bit of the model. It would be, we don't want to exclude foreigners. We want to bring them in because we've got a product here. We've got a global product. We want to enhance that product. We want to bring them in emotionally, spiritually, and financially as well. It'd be a really good idea to give away 10% ownership rights to foreigners, so they could pay £1 a month to be part of, to own not the wider manufacturing sector, but the football club itself. You've got to think about this PCP as a Russian doll, the big one, and inside that you've got the football clubs as well. So the foreigners could have a genuine stake in our cultural phenomenon that is English football. You'd have regular email correspondence through that. You'd have voting on certain decisions. Obviously, we'd be full members, but they'd be part members. You'd get access to our social media platform talk about this digital tech platform, we've got to set up our own social media. And if you pay £1 a month, foreigners can be involved in that as well. Nothing's anonymous. If you want to post something, we know who you are. If you want to just read it, like I think most people do, you can be anonymous. So it's that choice. But in this, your data is protected. You're not getting advertised to. It's a genuine social media platform of how Twitter probably used to be. Instead of how it is now, which is very hate-filled and a lot of advertising and a hell of a lot of propaganda and a hell of a lot of bots.
That's just in my DMs. Yeah. So where we are now with football happens slowly. Can your idea actually happen quickly, if at all? Any idea on a time frame?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. We talked previously about the Premier League era taking 10, 15 years to materialise. This can be done in 4 years. It can be done by 2029. In the book, I talk about the idea of how we build a political movement. But it takes mass support. There's no getting around that. This is the only way to do this is through mass support. The Labour government, as it is, aren't going to be very fond of doing it. There's a lot of lobbying power in the way of it. Saudi Arabia are actually quite an influential lobbying power in UK politics. You'd have to overcome that. The way you do it is you threaten their narrow majorities. There's a few ways you can do it. But first of all, is to set up a political party, go on the front foot, take the local elections. They're really easy to do. You organise this through our club's trust foundations. Take the local elections. It builds belief. Also, form a genuine party. This isn't the best way to do it. I'll speak about the best way to do it. But you form a political party. If no one's listening, we go for it. In certain regions, I'm thinking particularly Manchester's a real hotbed for reform. They want the Glazers out. And that part of the country would benefit so much. There's a really interesting reversal of the north-south divide here. Manchester and Liverpool will get the most money because they've got 650 million fans worldwide, according to research. If 500 million people paid £1 a month, that's £6 billion a year into Manchester. And they're just so annoyed with the Glazers. You could pick up a few MPs in Manchester. If you can get 10 MPs and get a hung parliament, you think about what happened with the DUP. When the Wales coalition, you get a lot of political power. You can get this over the line. It's only a small amount of GDP, tiny percentage that we need. We need a stimulus package as well, but to get through the first couple of seasons. This is the greatest political idea of the 21st century. I think this is going to play out. The more you think about this idea, the better it gets. Because the economics is so good. It'd be fully costed. We can pay this money back. We can force the agenda through a hung parliament and a smattering of MPs being elected. But the best way to do this is to get this agenda on, because we've got first past the post here. You need that agenda on both political parties. Don't see the political parties as adversaries. See them as potential friends. You need to, if Labour did it, the Conservatives, they'd have to do it because it's about popular support. Yes, there's powerful lobbying groups in the way, but their first aim as a political party is to get elected because they've got other people lobbying them as well. So that's the best way to do it. How long that can take, I don't know. It depends how well the book does, I suppose, in some ways. Is this going to be ignored, or is it going to build slowly, or is it going to be a phenomenon where we just get hundreds of thousands of people beginning to organise? The great thing about football is it's a really interconnected network of about, 10, 15 million people who all communicate regularly. The net is like a petri dish. If this idea can grow, we can just begin to do it through our own trusts. Sheffield's a great place to start this as well because it's a two-club city. You'd work together. That's what this is about. As football supporters, it's fun to heckle and to, the way we treat each other. Yeah, but we're like competing siblings, really. We're all part of the same thing. And that's what you've got to realise. By coming together, I think actually we become unstoppable.
I am conscious of the time, so we're going to sort of rattle through just some questions. I'm already predicting people will say, because you mentioned a wage cap, that is two words some people really don't like. Could that leave us open to other nations in Europe or maybe even further afield paying very high wages and taking the best talent?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about four guiding principles that I've got for regulation. One, create profit. Debt's ridiculous. You don't need debt in football. You know, this is sport, not business. Debt, you know, liquidations belong in the commercial realm, not in the sporting realm. Create profit, number one. Number two, key. Ensure that world-class players play for English teams. Number three is promote local talent. We want local lads to do well. And number four is promote sporting integrity, fair competition. So how do you create profit? You've got to do a wage cap. There's no way around it. The way of protecting it, the idea that all the quality players will leave, is to keep it really high. The wage bill is incredibly high. We're already spending way more than anyone else. Like I said, it's about $3.5 billion. In my model, I've raised the Premier League wages to $5.5 billion, and I've cut squads to 30. This is what the MLS do. Squads are cut down. You can't have huge squads, and it increases that reliance on your own academy as well. And they've also got the designated player rule. So they use this to sign David Beckham in the MLS, LA Galaxy. So you can sign 3 players outside your wage cap, and that's how you get around it. So you've still got room for free market economics, but only to a certain extent. So 20 teams in the Premier League, you know, you've got 60 world-class players there, but it's spread throughout the league. You could be offering £1 million a week, no problem. I've said 25% of your commercial revenue could be spent on 3 extra players. It could be 4, it could be 5. So we've got to talk through this, and I think you want to play safe. You go 5 players outside the wage cap, a squad of 35. But how do you make it fairer? I've come up with something called the homegrown rule. You've got to play 2 players on the pitch at all times under the age of, say, 23 that were born in your area, and there's no way around that. You can't rehouse kids. They've got to be born in these hospitals, and that makes football clubs look inwards. You've got to. If you don't create amazing kids, your first team will have weaknesses. And you know, a player like Phil Foden comes through, which is incredible, you know, world-class talent. But then he gets to 23 and you've got to go again. Someone like Trent Alexander. But what you'll get then is, like, you will get world-class players coming through and they'll stay in the team. And then hopefully you've got 4 or 5, 6 players in these amazing world-class teams that are from that area. And I think that's the best way to do it.
Well, if you want to support Micky P. Kerr, then go and check out the book. Pre-orders are massive for books, and I know you'd very much appreciate that. You know, just imagine our football club being ours. We take the ownership of the club, the culture, the ethos. The parity could be slowly restored. Profit might actually happen again. You know, for clubs like ours. Imagine that,
and imagine local lads playing. Imagine.
And not just being sold.
Where you can actually go in and, do you know what? In a couple of years, we win this. To have,
because of course that's one of the things, Micky, is that, you know, if I look at Archie Gray, for example, you know, coming from a Leeds United stalwart family, and then the first sniff of real money gone, and that, as a fan, I can imagine, you know, we've seen it at Sheffield United with a number of our players, Kyle Walker, for example. What's the point?
Yeah, I mean, all the best players and all the best coaches in the world have been sucked into about 12 clubs. And that's the way it is. And even at 18 now, you know, they're gone. And this monopolization process, when I'm not talked about the psychoanalytics, you know, but it's distorting our mindsets as well. I think we've come to accept a Darwinian nature to football, like, as in smaller clubs should naturally be steamrolled. And we've got to address that.
Well, you get the term, we're a selling club, and fans will actually say that almost like a badge of honour. And gosh, it would be lovely to never hear that term again.
And you know what's quite funny as well? People talk about, you hear it all the time from fandom, oh, we've done great business on that. It's like, mate, you don't own the business. It's not your money. You know, let's stop pretending. Our football clubs are not ours. They are private businesses fenced off from the not common ground. And there will be in this model. You will own the business. You will own that money. You will decide what to do with that money, and you'll be tethered to locality, just like every club should be. But it's only my opinion, and the idea, I think, is let's create this debate. Let's see what we can do. And I think that, in a weird way, you know, when looking back at the Victorian era, these people believed in themselves. They had such great ambition, and they believed in Britain as well. And we've got this kind of declinist state. This declinist mentality. We've lost our empire. Let's just lose our football clubs as well. You know, we've got to go on the front foot. Britain needs to change, and we can change it.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I wish you well with the book, Micky P. Kerr. Thank you again.
Cheers, mate.